Thank you, President Foster. We're going on with item E2, which is a local control accountability plan update, our monthly update that we have focused on one of our 12 quality school indicators. The one that we're giving an update on tonight is the indicator called broad and challenging curriculum and combined with safe and well-maintained facilities. And this presentation is very similar to the one we had last month where we focused on middle school, and we focused specifically on the areas of the D and F report, attendance, chronic absenteeism, suspension rates, expulsion rates, and English learners. And we did that last month in the update for middle school students. And so tonight you see our entire team here tonight to present the same data but focused on our high school students. So what you're going to hear in tonight's report is information on our DNF report, attendance, chronic absenteeism, suspension, expulsion rates, EGALs with reclassification. And the way the report is structured is we break down each of those areas, which are the metrics that we're using to see the impact of the plan, our local control accountability plan. We want to see the impact, and we break it down by grade, by cluster, by ethnicity, by student group. And by student group, we look at students with disabilities, we look at English learners, and we look at low income. And so in each area that we are monitoring and looking for feedback on, you see it broken down into each of those subgroups. The other way that this report tonight is structured is, as you hear, you'll hear DNF report, you'll hear it broken down grade, cluster, ethnicity, student group, and then we'll move, and then when they're finished with the DNF report in each of those subgroups, you'll hear staff present on the essential questions that are brought up based on that data, and you'll hear staff's recommendations for next steps. And I know it's very difficult for us to not respond and react with answers and next steps and to say, do this, fix this, do it now. I encourage us to listen to staff's report on what questions come up. This was a group effort to put this together, and know that each of our updates go from here out to the clusters, out to the advisory groups, and the advisory groups engage in what are the essential questions that are brought up from this data, and then what are the next steps. And so staff, of course, has done initial thinking on the next steps. This is earlier tonight when I talked about the May revise and the input process for how do we decide how to allocate our resources. It comes from data, and the data, the next steps, actually helps us understand and make decisions about how to best allocate resources, saying we made some investments in year 1 and going into year 2 of our LCAP. How is that going? And the data is actually the flashlight that we need to say the places where it's working and the places where we need to improve, and you'll hear what essential questions come of it, and then what next steps are required and suggested by this initial thinking, and then we go out to the community to hear more next steps. And so when I say that the input process, we get input from the data and we get input from the community, and we look at both together. If you make decisions by data alone, you don't get it right. If you make decisions by community input alone, you don't get it right. It's the combination of both, and it's our commitment to have ongoing monthly LCAP updates so that we can say, here's where we decided to invest and how's it going. So with that, tonight's presentation on with the high school focus on 2 quality indicators of broad and challenging curriculum and safe and well-maintained environment. The 4 focus areas will answer those questions.
And Superintendent Martin, I think I heard you say that the preference would be to kind of listen through the presentation and take notes, and then at the end we could ask questions. So we're going to do the best that we can with that. So we heard you, we received that. So with that.
Thank you, and you'll see there's a pattern to it. The DNF report, essential questions, next step. The attendance report, essential questions, next step. So each of these, you'll hear that, and then at the end you can engage in dialogue. And I'll introduce the staff we have here tonight: Cheryl Hiblin, our high school resource officer, Felicia Singleton Daniels from Placement and Appeals, Sophia Freire, area superintendent, Vernon Moore from youth advocacy, and Fabiola Bagula, area superintendent. And it's a team effort, and they'll pass off when they need to.
Good evening. The portion of the PowerPoint that I will share with you tonight are the D's and F's. The first slide is a snapshot of the D's and F's earned by students in grades 6 through 12. I think the point of this slide, or at least the piece that sticks out the most, is just that in grade 9, which was similar to the middle school presentation, almost a quarter of our 9th grade students are earning D's and F's in terms of grades. And I think this also really justifies the work and the piece that we've been doing around early warning systems, looking at our incomplete policy, and investigating ways that we can meet students at their point of need through creative scheduling and potentially innovation centers at our high schools. The second slide takes a look at grade 9, 10, and 11 in terms of D's and F's over a 3-year period. I thought the interesting thing about this slide was that really, depending upon what year, the percentage overall really didn't change. So what you see in 2014 was also pretty typical in 2012 and in 2013. The third slide breaks the D's and F's down by subject area, and unfortunately I don't think it was much of a surprise that our mathematics, in terms of the subject area, produces the highest number of D's and F's that our students are earning. I thought it was interesting that science followed it, and it made me wonder, are these the sciences that require math, the math-based sciences that are pulling the grades down? And then followed by language arts and social studies. So basically it's our core areas in terms of the areas where the F's and the D's are most prevalent. In the next slide, this is a look at the total percentage of D's and F's by cluster, and I would just remind you that these slides you're looking at 2013-14. We didn't look at this year's grades because we need the end of the year to come, because some of our grades move from F's to D's depending upon whether they're in math or science. So this is a look at the D's and F's by cluster, and one of the things that was prevalent in this particular slide was that our 5 priority area clusters that we have identified are the ones that are showing the most D's and F's in terms of student performance. This slide shows you the percentage of D's and F's by student group, and so what you see is something very similar. These are 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, and again it takes that pattern of being higher in the 9th grade and lower in the 12th grade, and you see that our English learners and students with disabilities in terms of D's and F's are following that pattern, especially in the 9th grade, where you see quite a considerable raise compared to the other groups. And then finally, this is the total percentage of D's and F's by racial and ethnic group. And what you see in here is the similarity, again, with the 9th grade being the highest, the 12th grade being the smallest. But our African American and Hispanic populations have the higher amounts of D's and F's, and especially in the 9th grade class. So the questions that this data brought to my mind were, how can we strengthen high school master schedules and course offerings to ensure that students are adequately prepared to meet or exceed the demands of high school and post-secondary coursework? How can we ensure that 9th grade students complete and pass courses during their freshman year? How do we ensure that students master math concepts during their first attempt at a course? How do we ensure that effective scaffolds and interventions are in place for English language learners and students with disabilities? And how do we engage parents and community partners in our efforts to support struggling students? In terms of next steps, continue to analyze master schedules and course offerings, collect data on grading practices, and assess the possibility of a policy on issuing incompletes. Continue the development of our early warning system so we can intervene before grades are assigned. Monitor the effectiveness of interventions both within the school day and after school. Begin the discussion to create a point of need innovation center on each high school campus to ensure that students' individual needs are met in a timely process. Consider efforts to help students set academic and career goals through a student dashboard that includes student strengths as measured by an inventory.
Good evening, everyone. I'm presenting attendance data this evening, and I'd like to preface today's presentation with stating that we had similar patterns in attendance in middle school as we did in high school, and so I just wanted to make mention of that. This first slide demonstrates attendance rates by grade levels K-12, and what we're seeing is consistency in the attendance rates at or above 95%, starting at K through 12th grade. The next slide is, well, hang on, I clicked way too many. This next slide is by cluster. And what we'll see here is we also have a lens on attendance rates, and these are averages. What we'll notice here is that there isn't a lot of discrepancy or gap among the clusters. What I will call your attention to is to a later slide that then looks at chronic absenteeism. That's where you'll actually see gaps in different clusters. And so if we just looked at this data on the surface level, it looks like we're all fine. Everyone's doing comparable, all the clusters are above 95%, so we're all good. It takes a deeper look into this data to actually look at some of these gaps, and we'll see that in a little bit. The next slide is attendance rates by subgroups. And similarly, we have the same types of data. When compared to the middle school data, there are slight dips in EL attendance rates from middle school to high school. The middle school average attendance was 96.2. At the high school, it dropped slightly to 95.4. And that's not represented in this slide, actually, because we don't have middle school data on this slide. This is just taking the middle school data that I presented last time and comparing it to this new high school data. So with students with disabilities, also there was a decrease in attendance from middle school to high school. The middle school data that we presented previously was 95.3. For high school, it's 93.6. For low-income students, there was a slight decline as well. Middle school data was 96.3, and high school, it's 95.7. So just a slight decrease in attendance from middle school to high school in our student subgroups. The next slide looks at ethnic groups, and very similar to the information we saw or data we saw for middle school, where our Asian and Filipino students have the highest attendance rates. Likewise in high school, highest attendance rates are our Asian and Filipino students. This was the slide I was referring to earlier in reference to chronic absenteeism. And just as a reminder, we identify the students with chronic absenteeism with students that are missing 10% or more of their instructional days. And now you can see huge gaps among the schools. And so we have these schools that may have attendance rates that are above 95% or at 95%, but yet they have certain students that are chronically absent. And these are the students that we need to target.
So these are by cluster right now, simply by the high school.
Yeah, but it was interesting as I was preparing for this, because it's high school data, then it is representative of the high schools. The next slide is chronic absenteeism by grade level, and there is a correction on this slide that I'd like to note. It says 0 before the 1. That represents K. That should be kinder there. And so we're seeing that our highest chronically absent students are in K, 9th grade, and 12th grade. And then our grade levels that have the lowest amount of chronic absenteeism is 5th grade and 6th grade. The next slide shows students who are chronically absent by subgroup. And so one of the things that I'd like to celebrate on this slide is that there was a decline in our chronically absent English language learners from 2012 to 2014. It went from 16.4 to 14.7, so it's a move in the right direction. The same thing happened with our low-income students. There was a decline from 14.5 to 13.4 from 2012 to 2014. We haven't been able to see the same trend in students with disabilities, so that's something we still have to continue to look into. This breaks down the same data, chronically absent students by ethnic and racial group. And district-wide, we saw a decline from 11.9 to 11.2. Our African-American students also had a decline from 14.5 to 13%. And our Hispanic students who are chronically absent also, there was a decline from 15.2 to 13.8. So minor movement, but movement in the right direction should be noted. This slide is a slide similar to what we showed in terms of the middle school data. Is just the ADA funding that's lost. Middle school data showed a 2.8 million loss of revenue because of ADA, and the high school data is over 4 million funds lost due to ADA loss. Essential questions regarding attendance. The neediest students have the highest percentage of chronic absenteeism, and how do we encourage these and all students to maintain good attendance? What is the difference in the attendance rates of students who attend their neighborhood school and students that attend another school by choice? What are the implications of ADA funding loss? How do we create schools and classroom environments that inspire students to come to school every day? Next steps, continue to develop welcoming school and classroom environments so students feel that their attendance matters. Strengthen first-time instruction so all students want to attend school every day. Continue to develop early warning systems so we can intervene sooner, and we can intervene sooner with the right kids, talking about the students with chronic absenteeism. Collaborate with school leaders to strengthen attendance monitoring systems and also attendance incentives programs. Engage parents and community partners in our efforts to improve attendance rates. And I'm going to hand it over to Felicia or Vernon.
Good evening. I'm fine. I mean, as long as the remote works. Okay, that's fine. Okay, again, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. I would like to preface the slides that we're going to see right here is letting you folks know that data tells a part of the story. We're going to look at suspension and expulsion data, and though our numbers in our district are relatively low, each time a student is suspended or recommended for expulsion, that can represent a significant time lost out of school, and it's a very major incident. And so even though, like I said, the data that we present, and we just have just a little bit of data to present because a more robust analysis of our suspension and expulsion data will be forthcoming in our annual student services report that we usually give in July. So this is a little bit of a preview of that. But this first slide shows, it was presented also at the middle school presentation, but it shows suspension rates for 2013-14 for K-12. And of course, we called out the issue that was going on in our middle school class, in our middle schools, with the higher suspension rate. But you can also see that 9th grade for our high school is significantly higher, and I think that speaks to something that Cheryl Hiblin mentioned about making sure we are monitoring our 9th grade, making sure that the transition from middle school is carefully watched, we have proper interventions and early warning systems in place. The next data slide shows us that Middle school suspensions are the top line, and there are some of our highest rate. You can see, though, since 2004-05 up to 2013-14, that there's been a pretty significant decrease. 10% in middle school suspension rates, a little bit about 7% in our high school rate, and our elementary rate has remained relatively low in the same over that same span of years. There's perhaps a lot of reasons why our suspension rates have declined, but I really want to point out that the Uniform Discipline Plan came into effect in around 2012 is when it was initially installed. So we're going into our third year of it, and it really gives some clear guidelines to our school leaders and others regarding suspensions. And so I think we're seeing an effort of folks looking very carefully at those guidelines and thinking very carefully and investigating very carefully before making the choice to suspend our students. I'll turn it over to Felicia regarding expulsions.
Good evening. The slide that we're going to be talking about tonight, it doesn't unpack by area or by gender or by race. So what it does is just gives a snapshot of data from the 2013-14 school year on where our numbers were with student expulsions. And while we see the highest numbers, with the highest number in middle school in 8th grade, we see that 9th grade and 10th grade fall really closely behind in the number of expulsions. And as Dr. Moore said, one expulsion is too many. I would like to point out in the research that we did with this data that we've been on a steady decline at least 5 years back with our expulsions. Dating back to 2009, 2010, we were at a total of 626 students that were recommended and 250 actual cases going forward. Down to 2013-14 school year, we had only 395 recommended, while 143 cases actually went forward. So I do want to celebrate that. And on this slide, again, you see we're focusing just on high school. This is 2013-14 data, but we took it a step further and looked at data for this year dating up into April 1st of this year. So for the high school students in 2014 of last year, we had 85 cases that had recommended to hearing. This year, April 1st, we had only 46, same time. And when we look at that data, what stands out for me is all the work that is being done with the restorative justice, restorative practices, also the move to focus on the big 5 zero tolerance offenses, and how we are doing that work. The staff and placement and appeal, we're really making ourselves available for not just professional development, but case-by-case consultation when these incidents are arising on campuses, making ourselves available to vice principals and principals to really talk through the case, look at interventions that need to be put in place, and really making sure that that work is done before a case actually does come forward.
So with regards to some of our essential questions, as we look, again, at a very, very brief view of this data, is we've heard in the news about the Assembly Bill 420 that passed and has mitigated willful defiance specifically at grades K through 3 in terms of a reason for suspension. Grades 4 through 12, though, districts have been looking at removing willful defiance as a cause or a reason for suspension. Most recently, a couple weeks ago, Oakland Unified School District looked at removing it as a cause for suspension K through 12. So that will be something that we will be coming up with some recommendations for and collaborating with our stakeholders and community around. But what will be our district policy regarding that, and what kinds of decisions will the board make as it relates to that? how many, and Felicia covered this, how many expulsion recommendations are being made and for what reasons. As we look into the data, we're seeing a lot of issues around substance use and abuse, and we're seeing a lot of places where I think we can shore up that the interventions to that program. And so again, in an upcoming board meeting, we would like to present some ideas around that. Specifically, San Diego High School formed a task force to really look at this and work with student services and counseling and guidance to come up with some really robust ideas. So those will be forthcoming. What are the effects of reducing the number of mandatory expulsions? If you recall, last July, we had about 12 reasons vis-a-vis a zero tolerance policy that students could be recommended for expulsion, and principals were directed to do that. Well, that was reduced to 5 in our expulsion procedures because that matches the 5 that are in the education code regarding actions that students take that can be result in a recommendation for expulsion. And so we've done that, and we're looking at the effects of that. And is that the reason for the lower expulsion numbers? And finally, how can schools share best practices? We've heard and seen before some of the work that's done at Crawford regarding the teen court and the law academy and the restorative practices. How can we take that to scale and bring that to other schools, or what components of that can we replicate? And I think those tie into those essential questions.
And as far as next steps, we would like to continue to develop and implement our current strategies. We know we've had a lot of discussion about PBIS and restorative practices and trauma-informed care, and to create school models to network and learn from. And we've already started that work actually this year with our pilot schools who are doing restorative work. We have monthly meetings where we collaborate and we bring our toughest cases and we share strategies that are working at school to not just inform but to encourage. Sometimes you feel like you're the only champion on your campus doing this work, but when you are meeting regularly, it gives you just the motivation to keep going. So we like to continue that work. Also developing teacher and student leaders within these strategies to share knowledge. We know that students are our best voices in this work, as we've shared with Crawford and actually at Hoover and other high schools. When you get the students involved, the programs actually, they get momentum and they sell themselves. We really want to build that portion of our next steps, and also develop a structure for systemic sharing and networking. We don't want this to be the chicken feed approach. We want this to be how we do business on a regular basis to ensure equity for all students and not just those students who happen to go to a pilot school, but we like to weave this throughout all of our schools. And lastly, solicit feedback from community students, teachers, and parents. We know that in this work we can't do it all by ourselves, and what we see in restorative conferences and circles when the community is involved, that also is another voice to share the work that we're doing.
Good evening. I also want to preface it that I was actually very surprised when I was looking at this data. It's very much similar to middle school. And I think that the silver lining in that is it's fertile ground for collaboration and problem solving. That is the silver lining, but I think that more needs to be done in that way. So getting started. The first slide here, it just represents how many English language learners are according to each high school. And we all know that there are different populations and different needs in all of our high schools. And as you can see, it's very clear that there's high concentrations. And with those high concentrations of English language learners, we have different needs. With those different needs, I know that certain schools have created strategies to help support their children. And I'm going to speak primarily about Hoover and Crawford, who have new arrival centers, who have courses such as ALD in order to continue to acquire the language and at the same time make sure that they graduate from high school. I do want to actually say that we have started this work already, and thank you to Ms. Hiblin and to Dr. Martell, who have started looking at the alignment, the vertical alignment, all the way from middle school to high school for our English language learners. And I know as a result of one of the meetings that I had with both of them, I was able to sit down with the Principal Young from Van and Principal Alvarez from Crawford to talk about how we can continue collaboration, because we have different supports but very similar needs. So then how can we strengthen that partnerships, and those schools are so close together that we can possibly even travel back and forth throughout the day in order for this. So even though we have these high concentrations, I also want to remind us that we have some beautiful stories about our clusters. And I want to specifically share last year's Crawford valedictorian. I'm giving lots of shout outs for Crawford today. I really love them today. Crawford valedictorian, and I will have to look up his name, Triet Pham, spent his first year at the New Revival Center, and this year he is at UCLA, so go Bruins. So there's definitely lots of really good work to be done, and that has been done at our schools. This next slide provides the typology of English language learner that exists at each grade, and again, very similar to our middle school data. So you can see the increase of reclassification from students from 9th to 10th to 11th to 12th grade. Now, this is not a comparison slide. This is going to take all of the data, but I'm going to assume that that is what happens. I also checked with those beginning and early intermediate. They are newcomer students. We still have students that come in from other countries and continue to be newcomers, but as you can see, there is a slight upward turn for reclassification throughout their high school journey. So this mirrors the prior slide, about 10% of reclassification rates, but this is a 3-year data slide, and I think even with the ebb and flow, I would call it a plateau as well. So we really need to think about what other strategies we have for language acquisition and ensuring that students are not only, again, acquiring a language, but also ready to graduate with our A through G requirements. The changes in SELT scores for fall 2013 in comparison to fall 2014. So this is 1 year's growth from 2013 compared to 2014, with the green representing the EL population who moved a level or were reclassified, the yellow who stayed the same, and then the red who scored lower. And again, it's the same issue with intermediate and early advanced. And this always just troubles me, because as I said to you before in middle school, this is I know tied to reading ability. And I know specifically, I know last year, I believe the story that I spoke to Anna Alvarez about at Crawford was that 50% of 9th graders failed their English class. And when we did some investigating of why, it was because their reading levels were at 3rd grade. So if I'm stuck at a reading 3rd grade level, I'll probably be stuck at intermediate. And so, but what I love is that once they break through, and they break through early advanced, it's almost like this clear shot towards reclassification and advancement. And we know that reclassification really opens a lot more doors for our students. And lastly, this slide represents the number of duly identified students as long-term English language learners and students with IEPs. Again, that huge bubble in intermediate and early advanced, same as middle school. So we have children that are stuck in this language acquisition level and are also dually identified, which again causes issues with how we schedule children in our master schedule. Is it based on intervention, based on IEP, based on language acquisition? So those are some decisions that we really need to take very seriously when creating class schedules for students. So again, the essential questions, and again, this is very similar, is how aligned are we with our reclassification process? Are we simultaneously developing pedagogical shifts and reclassification efforts? So it's not just about a number and reaching a goal, but really acquiring language. How are we building those pathways and opportunities for language acquisition is huge, especially tied again with the next one, which is organizing our master schedules to provide those A through G access coupled with language acquisition supports. Those have to work hand in hand. How is our district belief system driving? How is district belief system driving results? So this is a big one. How language is viewed. Language being viewed as a strength, not a deficit. I know that one of my favorite, I'm almost going to be 1 year old in this area superintendent position. One of my favorite memories is actually meeting with a lot of alumni, students, and community members from Crawford, and they said, we're the international cluster. So I know I refer them now to the international cluster. And so it's an international cluster, it's international languages. How do we see that as a strength? And then, as Dr. Ochoa stated at the Latino Advisory Committee meeting, this term of reclassification of how a human being can become reclassified. I understand that this has more to do with the way we test children for SELT and things like that, but I think we really need to take a look at what belief system is behind a historically marginalized population and how we call them reclassified. How are district bilingual programs contributing to English language outcomes? To date, we have no data on our bilingual programs. The fact that they're growing, and yes, there's research nationwide that says how good they are, but we need to continue to take some data from our own system to see how well we're doing. And what is the relationship between reading levels and language acquisition levels? I'm not a betting person, but I will bet on that one. The next steps, the reclassification efforts need to continue to be systemic. We started engaging in this piece and also include active parent education and engagement. I think this is a big one. A lot of our parents don't understand the American school system and what it means to be reclassified. The master schedule needs to be monitored and audited every once in a while to make sure that we have these systems in place. We need, again, begin to collect data on bilingual programs, continue to strengthen our Tier 1 instruction with reading strategies and courses such as ALD, again, simultaneously literate and language acquisition, build networks and systems for shared knowledge. Area superintendents will continue to collaborate with our system experts, and then continue those vertical alignments and include community, parents, universities, organizations, all of those in our community that are able to contribute. And I will end again with very similar to middle school, but really fertile ground for collaboration.
Thank you very much to the team for putting together this presentation, and I want to point out that for each of the areas that we're focusing on, the next step you can see include community, parents, universities, organizations, that we're not solving this on our own, we're not solving in isolation. There's no one division, there's no one leader, there's no one principal or one teacher or one community group that's solely responsible for what we see here. We're collectively responsible in a collective impact approach, and so you can see we've included that. Those are our next steps because it's the way we do business in San Diego Unified, and yet we also have subject matter experts. We have the research that supports actions that we're taking. Community alone will never solve it. Leaders alone will never solve it. Teachers alone, it's together, and that's an important feature of the presentation, that we continue to collaborate. And what does collaboration look like, and what does input look like, and how does data that is sobering, data that's startling, inform decisions so that we can make the right next best step for our students so that we can actually see impacts. And the data, when it's hard to look at, we go back to it's a flashlight and we make decisions based on what we see here.
So I'm sure that our board members have questions. And I hear about the master's schedule, and that's so important with this theme, and what's so important in terms of opportunity, access, and getting to the equity in all this. At the same time, what comes up is the instructional piece and the first best instruction and the work around that and what that looks like. So, at some point, I'm going to ask to kind of comment on, on how we are going to, how we're providing the supports with instructors in the classroom who are working with students every day, and not so much of the PD that happens away from the class, but the PD that actually happens in the class, so that we can assure or ensure that it's being incorporated and implemented in the classroom for students. So that comes up for me. And then with the academic language class for our ELs, that seems so promising in terms of just the return that we've had on that investment. It's just exponential. So I'm wondering how many native speakers are in those ALD classes that are far below basic, or however they need to acquire the academic language, right? And what is the impact, or how does that expedite the learning of our ELs? Because I know that there's also some research of, that the cross support or collaboration between the peer work with student to student. So in that academic language, I could class the native and the ELs working together. I can just only imagine, how that works. I don't know if we're tracking the effectiveness, of the integrated class, if you will. I don't know. So I don't know if you can comment on that, but that's something that comes up.
That's a really good data point that we need to start collecting, because I don't have that data. So I'm going to write that down to make sure that I can talk to who it is that collects this data to make sure that we have it for next time, or that we start collecting it, because it is very important. And you're right, children acquire language also by models.
Mm-hmm.
And so how are we organizing ourselves? Can I respond to your first comment,
Yes.
though? We, as area superintendents, we have been definitely encouraging and having learning cycles at our high schools. And we saw a beautiful example of that last week when we had high school professional development for principals. So we saw a teacher who has participating with a Common Core resource teacher, and they went through a learning cycle, and then we went to see children participate in this really engaging conversation, really beautiful conversation actually about World War II and dictatorships. And what arose too was children from Hoover whose country right now has a dictator. So it was a really rich conversation around this. After that was finished, the teacher helped lead professional development for principals. So there is a lot of strengthening our Tier 1 instruction, a lot of collaboration and blending those lines between teacher and administrator. But I will take note of your ALD question and data comment. Thank you.
There's more, but I want to, share.
Just a couple. Thank you, everybody. And again, it just shows the strength of the instructional team, leadership team. Cheryl, I wanted to, couldn't help but noticing that Kearney had one of the lowest rates of chronic absenteeism, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I haven't been there this year, but I can tell you that we watched very carefully and we intervened very quickly. So in Kearney DMD, which I'll speak from, we are constantly running and monitoring reports to find out who's where and when. And we work with a team. We will go show up if you're not at Kearney. We'll go to your house and ask where you are. And it is a smaller school, so we do have smaller groups of adults around the kids and keeping our eyes on them. One of the things that I would say, though, is that the master schedule work, one of the things that we're trying to do, because these systems like Mira Mesa are large, and we're trying to organize adults in a way that happens in a large comprehensive site so that there are a smaller number of eyes on a smaller number of kids. And I think at Lincoln we're even getting it down to the very team level within grade levels to do that. I was at Lincoln today meeting with several of the counselors, and one of the counselors said to me, when I was in a smaller school that wasn't a high school, I literally, a child would walk in my office, I knew their first and last name. He goes, at the high school, I've been here 1 year, when a kid walks in my office, I look at them and go, I know you're mine. But they're not sure. They don't have that relationship. So I think what's happened at Kearney, just in the division, is that adults have been able to notice faster because there are more adults around smaller numbers of kids, and we're able to kind of jump on that faster. I also think that at Kearney, the level of engagement, because what they do with schoolwork immediately has an effect, and you can't miss school when you have a project due for a client and you miss one day and you're not there for your team. So there's also a more rapid accountability. It's not just the grade at the end. Your team is going to be, where are you, what are you doing, we're going to have to pick up your piece of this pie. And there's that I don't want to say pressure, but that team mentality about getting things done.
And then I just, Fabiola, I love you calling out the term reclassification, and what that means is, do we think language is a strength or a deficit? And I wonder, how do we start a conversation about maybe thinking about another term and what that means to our belief system? Yeah.
I think we just started.
Yeah, right.
But say more.
Piece that came to that is, if I was all of a sudden put in another country, English would be my second language, and so now I have, in order to satisfy UC A through G, I have to learn yet a third one. And so there's a couple of things I think that it's multi-layered.
Yeah.
This discussion is multi-layered, and I think I agree with our superintendent. We just began it, and I think that that's an important next step for us.
And remember that this presentation is one that we have the conversation here, but then we take it out to the community. So when I wasn't being glib to say we just started it, we did just start it. Fabi was asking a provocative question, and it's part of this presentation. So when we're out in the community, people are going to respond to that, and there will be reaction to that, and there will be the kind of dialogue that needs to happen for us to hold up the mirror to ourselves and say, what do we think? Are we okay with that? And if we're not, well, what? Or if we are okay with it, why are we? If we're not, what would we be okay with? And have a deeper conversation about it, which is the intent of the ongoing engagement that begins the conversation here, but then it goes out with the structure we've created.
I just wanted to comment again on the absentee issue. I think we could probably move from the data about percent of attendance and really stick with the chronic absentees, because you can look at La Jolla, which relatively speaking has a lower attendance rate than some of the other schools, and yet their chronic absenteeisms are extremely low. And this is where we're really getting at the students that need the help, and we're looking at 96.1, 95.7 versus here are, 80 kids at this school who are, chronically absent, can use that help. So I think that would just be much better, what you've been saying, to focus on that. And then the other issue about the grades and the D's and the F's, I know it's a little bit different because it's not standardized, and certainly when you're comparing clusters, are the kids performing less well, or are they being graded differently at different schools? It's kind of mixing apples and oranges. But I think we really need to get the conversation going about D's and F's versus incomplete. And I'm saying that because we could mandate something on a district level, but the teachers really need to have broad-based discussions about what it means to have a D or an F, and how do we make, and we talked about this at the conference, but how do we make it easier for teachers to do, so that we're looking at, is it an increased workload for the teacher if they give them an incomplete because they have to keep following that student, or how is that managed? But I just think that conversation needs to go on if we're going to just eventually get to the point where we expect the students to master the material and be at a passing level, rather than just getting a D and an F and moving on, or simply repeating, which isn't the best way to do it anyway. But thank you very much. It's really good information.
Dr. Mark, did you want to?
I was wondering, are the Twains and the Garfields included in the district-wide data? Are your alternative high schools included in the district? What I'm wondering, if they're not mentioned and there's no chart, I'm wondering what impact does that have? What impact would that have on the data if they were included? Is it included another? Would that be what the other is? Okay. Okay. And then, it was just a question. And then in terms of attendance at the state convention for delegates, the California School Board, they talked about the importance of tracking on the chronic absentees. Chronic defined as 10% or more, and starting as early as kindergarten. And so I think what I'm wondering is, of these students who are chronically absent, how many of them picked up that habit? And I know it's not a child habit. Kindergarten didn't decide to go to school. It's usually the parent. I think it's really maybe a parent education, parent support. Maybe it's transportation. and those kind of issues, but focusing on attendance as early as possible and doing any interventions, including the wraparound services, may make a big difference. In terms of suspensions, we still see that spike in the middle school grades, and I'm still advocating for restorative justice in the middle school, making sure we begin to work with those students early, those students that show behaviors that are contrary to making progress, and then finding out why they're crying out and what we can do to help them. But great report, thanks.
I want to thank everybody for your report and working together. It's great to have such a strong academic team. I want to thank the Superintendent, Cindy Martin, for continuing to bring forward to the board Ds and Fs, broken out by grade level, broken out by school, broken out by clusters. And I think that just continually talking about it and focusing on it, hopefully, is encouraging schools at their site level with their staff and the teachers to have these conversations as well, to talk about what's going on at our school site and our different school sites, to have the teachers and the staff really think about ways to help students to achieve at higher levels so that they're not receiving as many Ds and Fs. And if the conversation is whether or not at the end we give them a D or an F or an incomplete, then we've all failed. It's too late. The real question needs to be, what are we doing at the first progress report after 4 to 6 weeks of that semester, of that term, to get kids after school, to get kids in on Saturday, to get kids in with college tutors after school or some kind of support to try to get them caught up and on task so that they can succeed. So at the end, the question isn't do we give them a D, an F, or an incomplete. The question is do we give them an A, B, or a C? And that's really what we need to continue the conversation around, is ongoing support for the students during the semester. And then the second comment that I think is really fantastic that we're having this evening is, comparing clusters. And when we look at attendance, I thought it was kind of interesting that Hoover High School has the highest attendance rate at 97.7%. And the lowest attendance rate is La Jolla cluster at 94.2%. And that's just kind of interesting data. And that's pretty important information. And so I wonder what's going on in the Hoover cluster. What are some of the things that those schools are doing? What are those leaders doing in those schools to incentivize? Are they having attendance programs? Are there rewards for students with 100% attendance each month or something like that? What's going on there? Are students encouraged to attend Saturday school for attendance recovery more in the Hoover cluster than in other clusters? So those are great opportunities so that if a student is absent during the week, then they can make up that attendance credit on Saturday, and in those 4 hours on Saturday, they could be getting some attention and help and support with college tutors or teachers to not get a D or an F by the end of the semesters. So those are some great things that I'm really thrilled that we're continuing to talk about it. And we didn't just bring it up at one school board meeting. We keep bringing it back and having the conversation again and again and again, and that is phenomenal. I'm very, very happy about that. Suspension and expulsion rates, phenomenal work there. But it's more than just a number. It's seeing things like what's going on at Miller Elementary School to help children focus on solving problems and being kind to each other starting in the elementary grade levels. And we want to try to see how we can build those programs. I think you mentioned, the PBIS program shouldn't just be at target pilot schools, but it should be systemic, system-wide, and making sure that we're trying to not just not give kids suspensions or expulsions, but change student behavior so that they aren't warranted. Because there's a difference between just saying, you know what, you can do whatever you want. Students run the school, here's the keys. You can do anything you want, and we're not going to suspend you or expel you because we're not going to do that anymore. That's different. That's a different conversation and a different climate and culture at a school, as opposed to saying we have high expectations and we want you to hold each other accountable for the way that you act and the kind of life and the kind of person that you want to be. And that starts now in school. And so changing that behavior so that the suspension and expulsions aren't warranted anymore is really the end game. So, and then the EL, didn't get to hear about it very much this time. The ALD classes. We have evidence and research in our school district that we have some systems that are having phenomenal results with the ALD class, and that we've rolled that out and expanded it to a few more schools. And I'm really eager to see some of that data come back and explore if we continue to realize amazing success for those children in those ALD classes, how is that going to build itself as we make master schedules for next year? Are we going to continue that plateau? Are we going to sit back and wait? Are we going to proactively look at those master schedules for next year and make sure all of our EL students are in ALD classes across the district, provided the evidence still holds up? Yeah, so thank you very much for your work.
And native speakers who are performing way, way below grade level as well.
Right.
So I just, thank you. Gosh, this is such an exciting and juicy conversation. I love it. So I just, before we wrap up, I just wanted to just throw out there, it would be nice to have a conversation about bilingual programs, immersion programs, biliteracy, and multilingualism, just to kind of differentiate and explain where those programs exist, with the backdrop that all students, our expectation, with Vision 2020 is that all students graduate fluent in 2 languages, preferably English and Spanish, and the third. I'm just saying, being that we're 15 minutes from the border to the second language of the world is Spanish in this globalizing society. But anyway, I'm just saying, if we can have a conversation about bilingual programs, immersion, biliteracy, and being able to differentiate between the two for the public, that would be very, very useful in moving that conversation forward. And lastly, Trustee Beiser was talking about the restorative practice and the difference between actually teaching and utilizing the restorative practice on school sites as opposed to just deciding not to suspend. And I don't know, but with the conversations that we heard tonight about Ross, it kind of sounds like, there's something going on there, right? And wondering, and then looking at Miller and the presentation that the students gave and the leadership presented about their PBIS and restorative practices was so powerful. It's like they're having the absolute opposite experience. So it suggests that there's a possibility for the sharing of the best practices that we've been talking about, and maybe they can share and start a relationship between Miller and Ross, because it seems like they're experiencing 2 different sides, of this behavior. And so I just wanted to throw that out there and what I saw there. Thank you very, very. Did you want to say something else, Trustee Evans, Dr. Evans?
No,
Oh, okay, I was just, okay. All right, well, you beat me to it. That's what I was going to. So anyway, thank you very, very, very much. Excellent.
I'd like to move item E4, the community-based summer readers, future leaders summer camp at